Hi, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Tech Talk, which is going to focus on Pega GenAI Socrates, our new learning tool on Pega Academy. My name's Chris Smith. I'm a senior manager in digital engineering in the Pega IT department, and I'm joined here today by CJ Jordan, who is our senior manager of curriculum development and the curriculum development team. We're going to talk a bit about the Socrates project inception, the development, and kind of where we see the technology going from here. CJ, this is great because I don't think we've had a real chance to catch up from all the hustle and bustle of Pega World yet. But for viewers that haven't tried Socrates yet, or maybe don't even know what Pega GenAI Socrates is and how it works, could you describe a little bit of that?
Yeah, so Pega GenAI Socrates is now a part of Pega Academy. Traditionally, in Pega Academy, we had some static documentation that you could read through, along with some video content and some images and some multiple choice, primarily knowledge checks and quizzes. Pega GenAI Socrates takes it into a really interactive, different direction, where the content is being delivered through a conversation style with an LLM. So it's an LLM-powered tool in which your learning journey is really dictated by your needs, your pace, your style of conversation. You're interacting with a GenAI-powered bot that is taking you on a journey towards deeply understanding concepts rather than just memorizing some of the vocabulary, which is a way that we were often limited to teaching with the traditional model. So it's a really interactive, engaging, fun way to learn, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds like very different from a traditional model where you're kind of just reading a bunch of stuff and then taking a quiz at the end. Much more interactive. What type of results are we seeing? I know it's only been a couple of weeks since Pega World where we unveiled this, but what's the feedback been like since then?
Yeah, so it's certainly new. Feedback is ongoing. Currently, we are around a 75% approval rate. So the majority of people are really enjoying this style of learning. And most of that positive feedback is really, I think, centered around the idea that rather than being presented, like I said before, with points to memorize, it was a little more rote memorization based previously. This really is driving towards a deep conceptual understanding, and it's contextualized within scenarios built around how you would use this concept in building a larger Pega platform application. And so I think it really contextualizes that learning a lot more.
Very cool. A lot of people watching this might be thinking the same thing that I thought initially in this project is we're using GenAI for everything now. We're throwing it at everything. What makes this a good application for GenAI? There's companies out there they're throwing GenAI on top of every product they have, and it doesn't always necessarily make sense. What to you, is the reason GenAI is a good fit here for learning?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think Pega as a whole has been really selective about where we're utilizing GenAI and really finding the right applications for it. And I think teaching is a natural one, right? I think there's tons of data out there that shows that people who have individualized tutors learn at a much faster rate, learn to a much greater depth. And that's just not something that's easy to scale in a technical space, right? We're aiming to educate thousands, tens of thousands of people a year. And scaling individual tutors has been something historically that just wasn't feasible. And this really allows us to do that, right? LLMs are really built for conversational style interactions, and they're really able to adapt to learners' needs. And so this was kind of, I think, a perfect space to leverage that, to really improve that learning journey for people.
From a perspective of kind of, the student's perspective, a lot has changed with this approach in terms of how they're interacting with the learning content. Do you think, over traditional kind of, read and repeat style learning with just taking a quiz at the end, do you think students will get, or what do you think the benefit will be to students over the traditional approach?
Yeah, I certainly think there's room for both, right? Different people learn in different ways. And I certainly think there's room for both approaches, and there's some material that lends itself well to a traditional format, right? If you're trying to look through a table of available, let's say, field values, that's pretty easily consumed in the old format. But I do think within Pega Platform, there's a lot of conceptual things that you want to understand, right? You're looking to architect a really complex solution, not just memorize some Pega terminology. And I think that's really where people are going to benefit from the Socratic approach, is that they can really dig into conceptual areas and work as deep as they really want to with the tool to develop that conceptual understanding so that they can utilize these various different Pega platform concepts in architecting their solution.
Yeah, I can actually share an anecdote for that. Recently, I've been at Pega for 8 years. I've traditionally been more on the web development side, digital engineering, websites, kind of non-Pega based applications, and I've been trying to learn Pega. I've tried a little bit both with our traditional training content on Academy and the new, Gen AI Socrates product that we've developed. I would definitely say, from a conceptual standpoint, I have understood what's going on behind the scenes a lot better as I'm taking it through the interactive chat experience versus just reading and taking a quiz.
And I think we've heard that in our feedback as well. I think from a partner, we had someone saying that data pages is something they had just really never actually understood. And it's kind of a marriage of a caching mechanism along with a standardized interface for working with external data sources. And there's a lot to it, right? There's a lot of depth to that area that's a little bit different than what you might see in building a traditional application outside of Pega. And we had a partner who said they just never really understood that. They've read through documentation, but they just had some little gaps that were getting in the way of their learning. And after going through that module with Socrates, they were able to engage a lot more deeply on that and ask those pointed questions of, hey, I don't quite get it. Is this client side? Is this server side? What is the difference between the list data pages and the single data pages? And they were able to get all those questions answered. And because it was a Socratic approach, it asked questions back to them to really reinforce that understanding and make sure that they deeply understood it. And we had a feedback come in where a user said for the first time ever, after working in Pega for many years, they finally understand this concept. So I think we've seen that not just from you, but from a lot of people.
Wow, that's really great feedback. I actually haven't heard that feedback before, so that's awesome. So I think one of the reasons we are where we are here now, and we were able to launch Socrates so quickly, I think, from the first prototype, like 6 months it took us to develop this. A big reason of that is, the work you did in developing that prototype and kind of the front work of figuring out what was going to work and what didn't. Could you take us through kind of that process, some of the things that were tried and how we ended up with the approach we actually ended up with?
Yeah, so we started out, I think we were all kind of excited about this idea of Socratic learning, and a lot of people in the learning space in instructional design space have heard a lot about that lately. And so we started out playing with a really strictly Socratic model. And the initial feedback that we got on that, I think it was interesting. However, there's a little bit of fatigue that comes with being asked question after question after question after question. People were looking for a little more dynamic experience. And there was also feedback from people who were coming in with a lot of Pega experience saying, hey, how do I quickly get to the content that I want to see? Because I actually know all of these things. So we switched to this scenario-based approach where we started with presenting a complex scenario of a client asked for a Pega application, and then querying how would you tackle this, how would you tackle that, so that the tool can understand the delta between what they already know and what we'd like them to know by the end of this module. And then the Socratic conversation is actually very targeted to the areas that this particular learner isn't familiar with. So rather than taking them through an hour-long conversation about everything, we can skip straight to, hey, here's the 2 things that maybe as an experienced Pega engineer you're not familiar with yet because they're relatively new. So it can skip straight to those areas, and then it engages in what we're calling a semi-Socratic approach, where it does ask questions, but it also does contextualize things. It provides explanation. It's not just asking you question after question, but it is pointing you in the right direction, providing hints, providing some examples if maybe your understanding is close but missing some nuance. And so it's really more like a tutor than anything else, I think.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen that in my experience, kind of from the early prototypes and what we actually ended up with. It's gotten a lot more dynamic and engaging, and I'm sure it will continue to do that.
Yeah, I think it'll definitely continue to evolve in that area.
Speaking on the kind of technology side of it, I'm curious to what extent, because you've been very involved with the models and kind of the prompt engineering side of things, designing the user experience. I have kind of I've had a more high level view of that. How much has the quality of models and the available models we've had as we're developing these prototypes kind of played into dictating the user experience versus like starting with the user experience and then finding the right model to match to that?
Yeah, I think that it's played in tremendously. We've tried a lot of different models, and we're currently using a lot of different models in the application. I think that what we've found is that different models are well suited for different tasks, and there are trade-offs between speed and robustness, conversationalness. That's probably not actually a word, but I think there's trade-offs between the various different models that you see, and different ones lend themselves better to different tasks. And so we've really kind of landed on this multi-model approach where we are using various different models from various different vendors for different applications within the product.
Yeah, yeah. Comparing that to kind of what you see across the industry, the common term like RAG architecture, right? Retrieval augmented generation. A lot of technical people watching this, might have even played with that already, where you have a vector database that's kind of serving up content that you're injecting into your prompts to run them through a model. So Socrates is a little more complicated than that, right? It's not just serving up information from you based on a database and kind of summarizing that information or answering a question. It's driving the conversation. It's asking you questions. So how does Socrates kind of technically achieve that, moving beyond the RAG model?
Yeah, so it fundamentally is still based on a RAG model. There is still a RAG behind it. All of the conversations that you're having are really firmly grounded in Pega documentation. And so that really is the information that's powering the conversation. But this is really different than what you were talking about, where it's kind of a simple question and answer machine where you ask it questions and it provides an answer to you. And we are in parallel running a lot of different prompts. Some of them are providing evaluation of your responses and informing the way that it should respond back to you, determining whether it's time to move forward in the conversation, how stuck you may be on a particular concept, or what your level of mastery is on it, in addition to providing several different potential responses, some of them more multimedia based, some of them more text based. And all of that is being aggregated together into one single answer that is presented to the user. So it is much more dynamic than the type of application you're talking about, but a lot of the fundamentals are the same.
Yeah. I actually want to dig in a little bit on the evaluation part because, again, from a high level
view, tough part.
Yeah, that part looks like complete magic to me. So can you kind of explain what's going on there and how we were able to, have a piece of software evaluate the student just through them typing?
Yeah. So part of what's going on there is that it's actually developing its own solution to the question. So it's determining against a particular learning objective, right? All of this is learning objective based. And so in each module, Socrates has a list of learning objectives, and the student can actually see that as well on the left-hand side, a list of learning objectives that it wants you to achieve before you've completed the module. And that, just jumping back a little bit, is something, again, really different between traditional and Socrates, is that in traditional, we had said, if you get 70% of the quiz questions right, we consider it complete and we move you forwards. This is really driving towards a mastery-based learning where Socrates expects you to have full mastery of every learning objective before moving forward. And so it is constantly looking through those learning objectives and the student's answers to see if it has completed any portion of that. And it has its own answer that it's comparing your answer to. And so it's looking for similarities between those things. And it's looking to see if there's key concepts that you may have omitted from your answer that it still needs to drive you towards. Or if you actually have hit all the key points, but maybe have a slight misunderstanding in an area, then it will tweak to adjust your answer and help you gather that more complete understanding of that area. So it really is performing a lot of calculations behind the scenes in terms of how well did your answer meet their complete answer? What are those deltas? And conversationally, how can it drive you towards that without just giving you that answer, right? Without saying, hey, Chris, you're kind of right, but this thing is missing. Instead, it says, hey, Chris, there's a slight misunderstanding here. Have you thought about this? How would you apply it in this scenario? And it's trying to drive you towards independently arriving at that conclusion of, oh, I've slightly misunderstood this thing. Here's actually how it works.
Yeah. Again, I would say magic, the fact that it works so well.
Yeah, that's what I said. It's magic.
Yeah. Uh, I imagine you encountered a lot of technical challenges in trying to implement that and get all these different prompts to work together and get all this logic to work together with the prompts. What do you think was the biggest kind of challenge you faced with this project, and kind of any advice you have for people out there trying to build more sophisticated agents like this?
Yeah, I have a lot of advice, and I'll say I'm a little uncomfortable with the "you" that you're using there because it certainly wasn't me. It was a team of people working on this.
You did a lot. You did a lot.
These prompts. But I think the first thing that I did that I learned from a mistake is that it is much easier to start with a more simple model and scale up than it is to scale back. And I say I learned that the hard way because I started working with some of the more sophisticated models. And when I realized they maybe were overkill for what we needed there and also were too slow to really have a responsive conversation, those prompts were not backwards compatible to earlier versions, where when I started with a simpler model or even an earlier model and then moved forwards, everything worked really well, and the quality of responses just improved, and we could just kind of lift and shift very easily. So I would say my first piece of advice would be definitely start with a more simple model, and then work your way up as needed, right? When you find that you've hit a limitation of that model, or when you've tested with a more advanced model and see that you're really getting a noticeable difference in quality of response, that's the time to move forward. So I think that would be my first big piece of advice. The second one is the more simple the prompt is, the better the responses you're going to get. So I think leaning into the LLM and trusting it rather than feeling like you have to give it very direct instructions on everything is a good way to go. I think there was many times that I would want to tweak its answers just slightly, and I would add another line to the prompt and then another line and then another line, and then I would have prompts that were this long and the quality of my answers were just dropping dramatically. So I think the shorter and simpler you can keep those prompts, the better. And another thing, especially, and this may not apply if you're prompt engineering in all languages, but certainly in English, there's a lot of ambiguity, right? There's a lot of words that can have two different meanings, and you have to be very aware of that when you're prompt engineering and think about, if you were some sort of machine, how would you interpret this? And because it is, it doesn't have the contextual understanding that we do. And I think that is getting better with every model, but certainly with some of the more simple models, you will find that it will often interpret things differently than you had anticipated. So being very unambiguous in your language, I think, is key.
Yeah, definitely. So what do you see as the next big steps, I guess, in this space, like both for Socrates and kind of, there's other organizations out there too that want to apply, Gen AI technology to learning in general. What do you think is going to be the next big leap forward?
I think there's a few areas that are really interesting for Socrates in particular. I think we're certainly looking at making it much more dynamic, right? I think that scenario-based learning is a great style of learning, but there's lots of great styles of learning, and I think everybody learns differently. And we've seen that from feedback, not just from Socrates, but across the board, right? All of Academy, we have people saying, I wish there were more videos. I wish there were fewer videos. I wish there was more interactive elements like H5Ps. I wish there was fewer of those. They take up too much space. I wish there was more robust scenarios. I wish there was less explaining how to build the application and more telling me what the feature is. Everyone has a different style of learning. And so I think really leaning into making this something that's really dynamic to the learner and really can teach everyone in the best way for them, I think that's what really excites me. I'm also really excited to see how we can apply Gen AI to video development. I think that is something that a lot of learners like, some learners hate, but I think there's a big demand for that. And obviously from a resource standpoint, that is a pretty intensive thing to do. There's scripting, there's shooting the video, there's editing, there's a lot to that. And so I think if we can lean into leveraging LLMs to help with that, I think we could really have a lot more content for those visual and video based learners. So I think those are two areas that I'm pretty excited about.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thanks, CJ. I definitely learned a lot today. And for other people out there that want to learn more about Pega Gen AI Socrates, go to academy.pega.com. And you can also reach out with any questions or any feedback you have to Socrates@pega.com. This has been great. Thank you.